Let's talk more about the idea of attainability. And specifically, I want to introduce to you the idea of assimilation versus contrast. So the consequences of up versus downward comparisons actually, as we've seen, depend on the implications for our relative position towards a standard. If we try to contrast ourselves, that means we try to move our self-evaluation away from the standard. And if we assimilate, that means our self-evaluation moves towards the standard. Okay, so in contrast, that means we try to move away from the standard. If we make downward comparisons, this means we produce a more positive self-view. And if we would make upward comparisons, well, that would mean we make ourselves feel worse, right? If we're in contrast mode, comparing ourselves upwards doesn't really help our self-view. On the other hand, in assimilation mode, moving closer to the standard, if that's the kind of mindset that we have, then making upward comparisons produces a more positive self-view, right? Because we're moving closer to the positive standard. But making downward comparisons produces a more negative self-view because we're distancing, we're moving towards a negative standard, okay? Okay, so but how do we get into assimilation versus contrast mode? Well, first up, Musweiler et al. Would have proposed the selective accessibility model. And this proposes that initially we assess the overall similarity or dissimilarity with the standard. So we use different cues for this. For instance, the category membership. Do we go to the same school? Do we have the same hair color? Is there any other category that's salient to which we both belong? And we also check other salient characteristics, like do we listen to the same music? And then we selectively look for information to further validate the level of similarity that we've initially established. So this would mean that the model presumes that we seek hypothesis-consistent information, and therefore this is why it's called the selective accessibility model, right? So this is about hypothesis confirmation. And last, we then use the accessible knowledge we've gathered in our evaluation, and now this is where evaluative consequences occur. So either assimilation or contrast mode starts. Now we can take a look at this idea, the selective accessibility model, in this graph here as a graphical representation. And what this tells you is that we start on the left. So first there's some holistic assessment of the similarity between the target and the standard. So am I different or similar to the target? And if I'm dissimilar, I'm taking the lower route. If I'm dissimilar, then we keep going with dissimilarity testing. So that means I test the hypothesis that I am not like the standard. And that means that information that means that I am inconsistent to the standard is actually becoming more accessible. So information about me being different from the standard gets more attention, and then therefore I am in contrast mode. If, however, my initial assessment of target's standard similarity says, yes, I am similar to the target, then we take the upper route and we go into similarity testing mode. So we test the hypothesis that we are actually similar to the standard, and then information that is consistent with the standard, with the idea that I match the standard, it becomes more accessible, and then we move into assimilation mode. So this is the idea of the process that occurs in deciding whether we end up in assimilation or contrast mode. So to break it down, you could say if there's a similarity focus, we end up in assimilation mode. If there's a dissimilarity focus, we end up making contrasts. So similarity testing is usually the default, but sometimes we are forced to use a particular dissimilar standard. And we can actually apply this to marketing and ask with a reality check whether we see lots of attainable beauty, for instance, in advertisement. Well, if you think a moment whether you think there's lots of attainable beauty, probably the answer is no. So advertisements usually show superior standards and make us make upward comparisons. So the idea often is that the consumer is supposed to be wanting to be like the beautiful, rich, prosperous people, happy people depicted who are using the product by using the product. And that means the idea is that marketing people aim for us as viewers to be in assimilation mode. But can one actually be like the person in the ad? Like, is the model similar, and is it even attainable to become like this model? Well, I want to talk to you a little bit about idealized media images. And to do that, first of all, we have to acknowledge that also the media, in terms of marketing, has some social responsibility. And by setting extreme beauty standards, they might even be setting unreasonable pressure on people to try to comply with these beauty standards. This is one perspective to why it might be problematic to use idealized images in marketing. But on the other hand, we could wonder if they're even effective. So is it even a smart idea to use extremely beautiful and smart and rich and happy people in marketing? Because, I mean, people like to have a positive self-image and they don't like to have it threatened. So if it is threatened, maybe people actually feel worse about themselves and they might have defensive responses. And that would mean potentially that they're less likely to buy the product and they don't like the product as much. So the question I want to raise here is how idealized images actually affect, in this case, women's self-image compared to attainable images of female beauty. Here I want to show a study where participants saw commercials with models of unattainable or attainable beauty. And then the self-evaluations of participants were measured. What we see here is, first of all, a self-evaluation when participants were confronted with a model who was either unattainably beautiful or more attainably beautiful. And you see that self-evaluations were more positive when the model depicted was a model that had attainable beauty. Okay, so far no surprise. That would mean, just to translate it again, that to reduce negative effects of upward social comparisons in advertisement, it would make sense to show attainable models. But is there another way that this negative effect can be prevented? Because, I mean, this is not what's happening, right? Most of the advertisement that we thought about, when I asked you about this initially, they use unattainable and attainably amazing people often in their campaigns. So another way to go about reducing potential negative effects is to guide the focus of comparison by thinking about assimilation versus contrast. So can we guide the focus of the comparison, and then how will this affect our product evaluations? Well, here, if we follow again the idea of the Musweiler model that we talked about before, we could formulate the general hypothesis that the focus of social comparisons determines its consequences, right? The idea is that comparisons have a starting point, that's the subject, me, and a referent, the standard, okay? And this would be asking, like, how assertive are you compared to someone else, or asking how assertive is someone else compared to you. So which bit I use as a starting point determines the similarity, the perceived similarity between the objects. Okay, but also the similarity between objects is determined by the number of unique features of the starting point. And the starting point could either be I or the other person. And the more unique features the starting point has, the less perceived similarity occurs with the referent. So can we try to make leverage of this? This would mean that we are more aware of our own complexity, of course, because we know more about ourselves than about some model in an advertisement campaign. And therefore, we see more unique attributes to ourselves than in a comparison standard, for instance, the model. Now, if we employ our selective accessibility model, this means that for comparisons with similar others, right, remember, that promotes assimilation, and comparisons with dissimilar others promotes contrast. So specifically, if we now puzzle all of this together, we would say that if the direction of comparison starts with the self, so I compare myself to the other, this means that I invoke that I have lots of unique features. That means that I am in a mode where I think about few similarities. And that means that I will end up making contrast comparisons. However, if I compare the other to myself, so if the starting point of the comparison is the other, then I would end up in assimilation mode. Why? Because the other has less unique features. So the other has few unique features, I have more. That means there is a perceived similarity that is higher, and then we end up with a more likelihood to have assimilation mode. So in the advertising context, there was a study conducted where participants either got contrast or assimilation instructions. So they were told to either compare themselves to the model, so the direction of comparison is self to other, or to compare the model to themselves. So the direction of comparison is other to self. And then they were exposed to advertisement that featured either a model that would prompt them to make an upward or downward comparison. And as dependent variables, we have the self-evaluation, so how did participants feel about themselves, and also product evaluation, so what did they think about the product. So first, let's take a look at the self-evaluation. And here we see the other self on the left. So if other is used as a starting point and then compared to the self, and on the right, self-other comparisons, this is the comparison starting point with oneself and comparing oneself to another. And we have the, in blue, we have the model or the standard, the referent, being a person who was relatively unattractive, so it would be the downward comparison, and then in pink the attractive model, that would be upward comparison. So people who use the model as a starting point, this is the other self comparison on the left of the graph. For them, we can see that they use an assimilation strategy, right, according to our model. So their self-evaluation moved more to their evaluation of the model. Participants who had to compare an attractive model to themselves evaluated themselves more positively than participants who had to compare an unattractive model to themselves. Okay? But we see the opposite for participants who used themselves as a starting point and then used a contrast strategy. So their self-evaluation moved further away from their evaluation of the model. And that means participants who had to compare themselves to an attractive model evaluated themselves as more negatively than participants who had to compare themselves to an unattractive model. Okay? So this actually fits perfectly with our self-evaluation maintenance model. And this is evidence that if you gear people into using themselves as a referent, it actually makes sense to use themselves as a starting point of the comparisons. What I meant to say, it actually makes sense to display an attractive, unattainably attractive even model. Okay, so here's some more data on the evaluation of the product. So we have, again, the other self evaluation comparison on the left. So you can see here there's not a big difference between the attractiveness conditions. So the attractive versus unattractive model didn't lead to a big difference in the product evaluation. But what you can see is that when participants use themselves as the starting point, this is on the right, then actually the product evaluation plummeted for the attractive model to be shown. So this means that the focus of comparison influences the effects of the social comparison. If the other is used as a starting point, that means we focus on similarities, we assimilate, and that means in this case an attractive model has a positive effect on the self-image. But if you use the self as a starting point of the comparison, that means dissimilarities become more prominent. We go into contrasting mode, and that means that an attractive model would actually have negative effects on our self-image and on product evaluations. So if you wanted to apply this to classical advertisement with highly attractive models, don't let customers take themselves as a starting point, but rather have them compare the model to themselves. So this is it for this session. We talked about social comparisons, and we talked about the when, why, with whom, whether it always is the case, what happens if we do it, and how we feel when we do it of social comparisons. I look forward to seeing you again next week. And stay home, stay safe, and stay sane also. And I'll see you then.